August 6, 1975, 24-year-old Tanya Ruiz disappeared in Peru, California, roughly an hour and 24 minutes away from Arvin, California. She had been visiting her grandmother for the preceding 3 or 4 days. When she did not meet her grandmother, Mrs. Peterson, on Sunday morning as planned, the family began to search for her. A few days after her alleged disappearance, Alejandro, Tanya's husband, called Mrs. Peterson and asked to speak to Tanya. He was told that she had been left at the ranch where she lived, and Alejandro replied, "Well, she isn't here. I guess she's visiting someone." He also rejected Mrs. Peterson's suggestion to call the police, stating he did not want to cause any trouble. When Mrs. Peterson suggested that something must have happened to Tanya, Alejandro remained silent. Additionally, Mrs. Peterson told him to drive to places where Tanya could be staying, and Alejandro rejected that idea. There was a nearby bakery in Ojai, and Alejandro suggested they go there and talk to Jim. However, when Mrs. Peterson went there was no one working there by that name. 2 other suspects, a ranch foreman named De Jarnet and a neighbor named Stafford, were both questioned by Alejandro about Tanya's whereabouts. Both men simply stated she left. They said Alejandro was acting very nervously. Tanya wore a Medi-Alert bracelet, and she took Diatlin for her epilepsy. Her current physician was never contacted for her medical records and to update her medication to a new address. The only photo available of her is of terrible quality, and she is not showing her teeth, but it seems like her face and nose shapes could match up. She was 5'6" and had strawberry blonde hair. She had 2 large front teeth. She was most likely white Caucasian. She had cerebral palsy and epilepsy resulting from an automobile accident. NameUS.org stated Tanya's right side was spastic. Her leg and hand were slightly malformed, and she wore a brace on her leg. In June 1978, her partial remains were found in Arvin, California. A news article from the LA Times states more information about the case and Tanya's husband. Tanya married Ruiz, whose full name is Alejandro Gilbert Ruiz, a former Peru ranch hand, in 1972. Her parents, who ran the Ranch House Cafe in Castaic, thought he was the best thing that ever happened to their daughter. Growing up, she was a shy and sickly child, but she broke out of her shell with Alejandro. After marriage, Tanya's husband showed a whole new side to him. He would leave his wife at home for weeks at a time. Upon return, they would argue and get into terrible fights, which the police were often called. Tanya told her mother several times that her and her husband were not getting along, and she was scared to death of him and his terrible temper. When they questioned her husband, Tanya had been missing for about 2 months. He did not seem to care or be concerned for her well-being or whereabouts. He told the deputy that Tanya had taken $150 to $200 and some clothes with her when she left. Although police were suspicious of the husband, they turned up no clues and dropped the case. She was receiving Social Security at the time of her disappearance, and the uncashed checks were returned to the government. No requests were made from Tanya to resume these payments. She was also in contact with her mom monthly, which ended once she disappeared. Several months after her disappearance, her mother went to the house where she stayed. Her belongings were still there, including her purse, wallet, ID card, and Social Security card. She usually kept these items with her. Alejandro's 5th wife, Pauline, and her 14-year-old son, Tony, were found dead 3 years later. They were found buried in a shallow grave in the backyard of their home near Peru, California. The cause of death was gunshot wounds through the backs of their heads. Also found in the grave was a small figurine, which investigators described as a voodoo doll, with a pin stuck through them. Witnesses testified that Alejandro believed in voodoo and psychic stuff, and that he believed his parents had a spell on him. A little bit about Pauline. She was a Jewish woman from Paris. She escaped the Nazis by hiding with Catholic nuns in the French countryside before coming to the United States as a teenager. Shortly after her marriage to Alejandro, his infamous temper showed through. She told her friends that he beat her. One time after a nasty fight, Pauline warned her friend, If either Tony or myself or both of us turn up missing, raise hell with the police because we will be dead. On June 21st, 1971, the skeletal remains of an unidentified female were found in a shallow grave at the grape vineyard located 1.4 metres east of Wheeler Ridge Road and 50 yards south of Maricopa Wheeler Canal. This body came to be known as Arvin Jane Doe. She was likely working at the grape vineyard where she was found, helping harvest. To this day, her hands and limbs were never recovered. Arvin Jane Doe's body had one or both hands missing. Therefore, it is likely her killer removed her hands. If Tanya was Arvin Jane Doe and she had a malformed hand, this would give her killer a valid reason to remove her hand so that she couldn't be identifiable through the malformation. In addition, the hole caused in the side of her head from her childhood car accident was a significant skull injury that would be identifiable looking at her body. Her husband Alejandro was the first person in Ventura County to receive the death sentence after California voters reinstated it in 1978. He was sentenced to death in 1980 for the deaths of his ex-wife Pauline and her son Tony. Although there was not enough scientific evidence to prove it was Tanya's body found, the jury found massive similarities in her disappearance to convict him of second-degree murder. Alejandro filed a petition for right of habeas corpus in 1989 in federal court. Included the claims raised in the petition was that he was incompetent to stand trial. Counsel for the state of California requested that the federal proceedings stay because his schizophrenic and brain damage made him unable to effectively communicate with his appointed authorities regarding his claims. When he was initially arrested in 1979, his court-appointed attorney, Larson, stated that the doctors at San Quentin had diagnosed Ruiz as a schizophrenic. He filed his concerns in the U.S. District Court in San Francisco and said, "Someone with psychiatric problems may have a different view on the world. This should have been raised during the penalty phase, but was not." On December 20, 2006, Judge Cooper denied the stay and scheduled the evidentiary hearing on the more than 25-year-old claim that Ruiz was incompetent to stand trial in 1980. The evidentiary hearing was set for April 4, 2007. Ruiz died on January 4, 2007. The cause of death was said to be natural causes. At his end, Ruiz had 3 remaining federal habeas court claims pending before Judge Cooper in the U.S. District Court for the Central District of California. The petition of right of habeas corpus that Ruiz filed in 1989 in federal court remained for 18 years and was still pending when he died in 2007.